I'm Emily Youngbloom, a student at the University of Washington's Engage program, here to welcome you to our event tonight. I will be talking about differentiating brittle bone disease from child abuse on the 1st of May at 6 p.m. I get to have this opportunity because of the special collaboration between Town Hall and the UW's Engage program. Together, they host a series called UW Science Now as part of the Seattle Science Lectures. Sponsors include Microsoft and KPLU. And now to our first guest. Kelly Fleming is a fifth-year chemical engineering PhD student at the University of Washington. Her research focus is molecular simulation of reactions important for biofuel processing. Outside of research, she runs the UW Science Policy Committee, writes a science blog called Gray Matter Happy Hour, and writes for a Denver Broncos blog called the Mile High Report. Her talk this evening is entitled Exploring the Efficiency of Biofuel Production. Please help me in welcoming Kelly.
Thanks for that introduction, Emily. As she stated, my name is Kelly, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the research I'm doing on biofuels and making them more economically and environmentally sustainable. So I'm going to start off my talk about a man named Linus Pauling. And Linus Pauling was one of the greatest chemists who ever lived. He had many accomplishments, but what he won the Nobel Prize for was defining the chemical bond. I think the chemical bond is really important to my research, which I'll get into a little bit later, but I think so highly of this man that I named my newest family member after him. This is my puppy Linus, and his greatest accomplishment to date is learning how to potty outside. So how did I get to this point where I'm naming my pets after famous scientists? In high school, when I walked into a room and I saw this site, I knew it was going to be a great day. So when I was a senior in high school about 10 years ago, we watched a Dateline video about global warming, and it talked about cities flooding and droughts and fires and hurricanes, and it scared the crap out of me, and it made me want to do something about it. Along with this time, I was totally obsessed with Bill Nye the Science Guy. I started watching his show after school every day at the age of about 9 years old. So these two things paired together made me want to become a scientist and set out to find a cure to this global warming. So when I think about climate change, it's still one of the scariest things that I think about today. The Earth is warming up at a threatening rate, and this has a lot of consequences. And I think it's going to be the hardest thing that our generation is going to have to face. Things like the polar ice is melting, which is causing sea levels to rise. It's disrupting food chains and causing a lot of other problems. The ocean is absorbing more carbon dioxide than ever before, meaning it's becoming more acidic because of the higher temperatures. This disrupts food chains, which includes the salmon here in the Pacific Northwest. And warmer temperatures are causing diseases to spread faster and through carriers like mosquitoes because they're living longer in different places and in larger numbers. So carbon dioxide is the reason that this is happening. Carbon dioxide is a gas, and it's called a greenhouse gas because it traps heat inside of the atmosphere. You can think of this in the same way that a greenhouse traps heat, or like when your car gets too hot when you leave the windows up in the summer. The sun warms it up and the heat can't get out, it traps it. So this is called the greenhouse effect. When excess carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere like it's doing today, the Earth continues to get warmer and warmer. So I'm going to talk about the carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide is natural in our atmosphere. If it wasn't there, it would be too cold to live here on Earth. So it's good that we have it. And the way that the Earth cycles this naturally is through something called the carbon cycle. So plants absorb carbon dioxide in a process called photosynthesis. And then they decompose into fossils or other types of organic matter underneath the ground. Or they're eaten by animals, which then breathe out carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And this is the basic, really simple carbon cycle. But when we bring humans into it, we've started burning these fossils as fuels, and that releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. In addition, we've started burning our natural carbon absorbers to build things like houses and cars and roads. So this means that we're emitting more carbon dioxide than the Earth is able to absorb, which means that we're heating it up because of the greenhouse effect. So fossil fuels are the cause of climate change. A fossil fuel is something like gasoline, diesel, coal, or natural gas. And if you look closely at this picture, you'll see that there's a little dinosaur in this gasoline droplet, and that's because fossil fuels are made from fossilized animals and plants. They're made from decomposed plants and animals that have been pressurized under the ground for millions of years, which is why they're called fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are literally made from dead dinosaurs and plants. These dinosaurs are dead, they're not coming back. This is why they're called non-renewable resources. They're eventually going to run out if we keep using them at the rate that we're using them, because we use them faster than they're made. So when we burn a fossil fuel, carbon dioxide is released. It's released at record rates every year, and this graphic shows exactly how much carbon dioxide is released when you burn a gallon of gasoline. So to put that into perspective, my car, which is a Honda Civic, gets about 35 miles per gallon. So when I drive to Tacoma, which is about 35 miles from here, this is how much carbon dioxide is released. And to kind of scale that a little bit more, this chart shows exactly how much carbon dioxide the average person releases every day. So in the United States, you can see that we release a lot more carbon dioxide than most other countries because we use a lot more fossil fuels. And so scientists agree that this is the reason that the climate is changing. We're burning fossil fuels too much, and there's a consensus that we need to shift to something other than fossil fuels in order to sustain life here on Earth. So researchers are studying different forms of energy to combat this challenge. For example, we're researching solar power, which harnesses the energy from the sun, which is not releasing carbon dioxide. We're also researching wind power, which harnesses energy from the wind, which also doesn't produce carbon dioxide. But the problem with these is that they're only working for stationary power. You can't take a windmill and put it on your car and drive with that energy. You can't use solar energy when it's dark outside, or you can't use wind energy when the wind isn't blowing, and we can't store it that way. So this is where biofuels kind of bridge that gap. They're a liquid, so we can put them into our cars, and they work the same way as fossil fuels, so we can use them in the cars that we already have, in the gas stations that we already use. So you might be thinking, okay, well, if a biofuel works the same way that a fossil fuel does, doesn't it contribute carbon dioxide to the atmosphere as well? And that's true, but I'm going to go back to this carbon cycle to explain that. Because plants grow quickly and they absorb carbon dioxide, it's considered a carbon neutral process, although they release it when they're burned. And they won't run out like fossil fuels will, because we can just replant them once we use them. But we do need to take into account how they're produced. Are we clearing plants that absorb a lot of carbon dioxide to grow plants that absorb less carbon dioxide? And are we using fossil fuels to turn these plants into fuels at a rate higher than what we're saving? So there are a few types of biofuels that are currently being used. The first type I'm going to talk about is called a first-generation biofuel, and it's called that because it was one of the first types of biofuels developed. It was actually developed before fossil fuels. And these are made from things like corn and sugar cane and canola oil and palm oil, things that are food. The next type that was researched and discovered is called cellulosic biofuel, or a second-generation biofuel. And these are developed from plants like grass and food waste and wood. And then finally, the newest type of biofuel that's being used is called a third-generation biofuel, and it's made from high carbon dioxide absorbing organisms like algae that produce oil that can then be turned into fuel. So there are a lot of trade-offs to consider between these different types of biofuels when deciding which one we should use in place of fossil fuels. First-generation biofuels aren't very sustainable. So if you look here, this is a corn ethanol plant, and it requires a lot of energy to fertilize corn crops and grow and harvest and water them, and in addition to the fossil fuels that it takes to turn these crops into energy. Not only that, but these compete with food sources. Especially in third world countries, this is a big problem because they're using their scarce food that they have to produce fuel like palm oil. And in addition to that, these types of fuels are causing deforestation at kind of an alarming rate. And the biggest example of this is the Amazon rainforest, where they're chopping down the rainforest, which is the Earth's natural biggest carbon dioxide absorber, and it's being cleared to grow sugarcane to produce ethanol fuel with. And obviously that's going to contribute more to the climate change problem than if we just used fossil fuels to begin with. So then second generation biofuels are fuels made from these plants that contain something called cellulose. And they look like this, so they don't require extra energy input to grow because we're not rotating the crops and fertilizing them, and we don't have to water them. They just grow the way that they grow. And in addition, they don't compete with food sources because we can't eat these types of plants. And then finally, we have third generation biofuels. And this is a picture of an algae farm. And so you can see that it grows vertically. And because of this, we get about 30 times more energy per land area than you would with a first generation biofuel. In addition, algae is a really massive carbon dioxide absorber, so it absorbs more carbon dioxide than the two previous plants that I talked about. So it's really efficient at producing energy with using a low amount of space and energy to produce. So you might be thinking, okay, well, why aren't we just using these second and third generation biofuels? They sound awesome. But the problem here is that it requires a lot of different steps and pathways to turn these into fuels. There are a lot of things to consider when we're choosing exactly how to go about this process. So we need to consider what are we harvesting and what is the cost of that? How much water does the crop use, which is something that Ashley is going to talk about right after me. What kind of processing does it take to turn this crop into a fuel? And what type of crop do we want? Are we using cellulose? Are we using algae? And those have very different processes. What kind of fuel do we want to make? Do we want to make ethanol that we can add to our gasoline, or do we want to make a heavier hydrocarbon like biodiesel? And all of these processes take specific reactions to happen, which is mostly what my research is on. A lot of these different reactions that happen to turn these plants into fuels. And there's a lot of processes that are I'm not going to focus on and my lab doesn't focus on, but it's important to know that there are lots and lots of different pathways you can take to turn a plant into a fuel. The reaction that I'm going to be talking about mostly in this presentation is called hydrolysis, and that's how we get from a cellulosic plant to an ethanol fuel. So I keep saying cellulose, but how many of you actually know what cellulose looks like? So for those of you who don't, I'm going to go back to high school biology, and this is a picture of a plant cell. So plant cells, if you recall from biology, plant cells have a different structure than animal cells. They have this thing called the plant cell wall that's a rigid structure around the cell. And these cell walls are made up of something called cellulose sheets. And this is a picture of a microscopic view of these cellulose sheets. Within these sheets, we have cellulose fibers. And these are really strong and they hold everything together. So when we look at the molecules that make this up, this is a cellulose molecule chain, and you can see that it's these rings that are all held together. So cellulose looks like this, and in order to make it into a fuel, we need to break this up into smaller pieces. And I'm going to come back to Linus Pauling right now. Linus Pauling defined the chemical bond, and he defined what makes it so strong. And in particular, the bond that holds this together, which is this bond right here, it requires a lot of energy to break. And that translates to a high energy cost. So breaking this bond is hydrolysis. That's what this reaction is called. When I break this bond, I get a sugar molecule called glucose, which is basically just two of these rings that make up cellulose. If we do a process called fermentation, we can get from the sugar to the ethanol fuel. And you might have heard of fermentation in a process that also turns sugar into the kind of alcohol that some of you are enjoying as I speak right now. It's the same process. You're going from from sugar to alcohol. To get this reaction to happen faster for animals that actually consume these types of plants, they have a special chemical in their stomachs called an enzyme. And this picture kind of shows a zoomed in view of a sheep's stomach, and these are the little enzymes taking apart the cellulose and breaking it into smaller pieces. But this is what an enzyme actually looks like. It's not a happy little guy in a factory breaking apart cellulose. So this is what an enzyme actually looks like, and it works by changing the energy of the reaction. It helps the reaction go through because it requires less energy. So to think about this in a relatable way, I'm asking, which of these would you climb over faster, Mount Rainier or this little hill in the California desert? Probably the little hill, because it takes less energy to climb over the hill than it does Mount Rainier. So we can think about this in terms of the reaction by putting it on a graph. On the y-axis we have energy, and on the x-axis we have start to finish. So we start with a plant and we end with an ethanol fuel. And in order to get from the cellulosic plant to the ethanol fuel, we have to climb over the mountain. So when we introduce an enzyme, that hill turns into a smaller hill. So the energy is lowered and we only have to climb over this little desert hill to get from cellulose to ethanol. So that's basically how an enzyme works to lower the energy. So in order to understand why this is happening, we need to understand more about what enzymes are doing to the reaction. So enzymes are specific to the reactions that they help, the same way that you have one specific lock for each specific key. So this little cartoon kind of shows, if you imagine the blue is the enzyme and the red is the molecule, the molecule only fits into the blue one on the left and not the one on the right. So that's the same way that there's only one type of reaction for each enzyme. And you can see kind of within this actual enzyme, there's little molecules within it, and those are the molecules that the enzyme is helping. So in this case, our key is cellulose, and the lock is the enzyme called cellulase. So cellulase is found in nature, and we can find it in things like fungus on trees, which help it decompose into soil and other things, or we can find it in the stomachs of the animals that I talked about, like cows and sheep and goats that actually eat cellulose. So this helps them turn that into smaller pieces so that they can digest it. So if we think about it on a larger scale, this is a cellulosic ethanol plant, and the enzymes required for this process are found in small amounts. So if I scale this, this probably is even smaller than I'm showing here, and this is a tree to scale of the ethanol plant. We need a lot of these little amounts of the enzymes to make a big ethanol plant like we would need to put in our cars. And that translates to a lot of money. So that's the problem with cellulosic biofuels right now. It costs a lot of money to get these enzymes in such large amounts, which makes it not very economically competitive with first-generation biofuels and fossil fuels. So we need to figure out a way to produce these enzymes on a much larger scale for a much less money. So the way that we do that is we're going to look more at exactly what the enzyme is doing to the molecule to help this reaction energy. And so I'm going to explain kind of how a reaction works with these props up here. So how a reaction happens is you have two molecules and they're kind of floating around, and every time they hit each other, they react. So if they're flowing freely, they might not hit that often, and that dictates how fast the reaction happens. But when we have an enzyme, so pretend like my hand is the enzyme, and this is the molecule that's reacting, and it fits perfectly because my hand is the lock and the molecule is the key. So when it's holding it here in place, this other molecule can come in and hit it more frequently. So that means the reaction is happening on a faster rate. So this little video kind of shows the same thing that I tried to explain with my hands. It might do a better job. It takes the two molecules and it puts them together so that they're reacting in a perfect way to form a product. So we want to know more about the shape of this enzyme and the molecules and how that's affecting the energy. So how can we look at these little details of the molecule to figure out what's going on? So you might be thinking a microscope. Unfortunately, these details are much too small to see with any microscope that's currently being used. So we can't use a microscope to look at this. However, we can use a computer. We can model an enzyme on a computer as well as look at the individual molecules of the reaction that we're simulating. So the way that this works is we can take equations and information that people like Linus Pauling or scientists in my lab have found and put it into a computer. In the same way that someone who plays pool can predict how to hit the ball using angles and speeds and maybe an equation if you're a total expert, they can predict how to hit the ball to make the other balls go into the hole. So the same way that the computer can take the equations and the information that we know to predict how the atoms are interacting with each other. So finding out more information about the molecules that are reacting can help us learn more about what the enzyme is doing. So we can learn things like, how is this bond angle changing? So if I take this molecule, like how is this action changing with the enzyme? Or how is this distance between these two atoms changing? I'm not supposed to pull it apart, but and how is this group rotating? How does that affect the energy? So we can look in terms of the enzyme, how is this molecule interacting with the lock part of the enzyme, these little pockets, and how does that correspond to the hill that it has to get over? So why is this hill changing shape based on how the molecule is changing shape, and what does the enzyme have to do with that? So using this method, this is one of the results that we've been able to find. This video shows what exactly is happening at the top of this hill for actually breaking the cellulose apart. So this video actually shows cellulose being broken apart, and that corresponds to the very top of the hill. So we can take out details like the bond distances and angles from this simulation. And understanding these details from the simulations that we've run, we can engineer enzymes in a lab to do exactly what we need them to do. So we can produce them on a much larger scale than what we can find in the stomachs of animals or in fungus on trees. And if we do that, hopefully we can engineer them to be produced on a large enough scale that we can just replace the fossil fuels that we're using. We can put this type of fuel into the gas pumps in the cars that we already have, and it'll be economically competitive with fossil fuels and first-generation biofuels. And if we do that, hopefully cellulosic biofuels will help us reduce our overall carbon dioxide emissions, which will help save us from all of the horrible things that I learned about in high school economics while we watched that video. So I'd like to thank Engage for helping me with my communication skills last quarter, and Town Hall for hosting me, as well as my research group, the Fentner Research Group, and our funding from the National Science Foundation, and my new dog Linus for inspiring me to talk more about Linus Pauling. So thank you. I'll take questions.
The fuels that you guys are studying, can they be used in regular vehicles?
So, like I stated a little bit previously, you can make a lot of different types of fuels with different types of plants and different processes from those plants. So what I'm studying right now is ethanol, which there are vehicles that use different amounts of ethanol. We all have 10% in our gas right now. So if you wanted to use all ethanol, you couldn't use that in the vehicles we have now. But you can use these cellulosic crops to produce heavier hydrocarbons, so it would be the exact same thing as the gasoline that you put into your car right now. But that would be a different process than what I just talked about.
So you're saying we are searching for a fuel that can go in the 85
Yeah.
Chevy
Mm-hmm.
and go in the new car
Right.
without retrofitting?
Yes.
Thank you.
So we're hearing lately a lot about the scarcity of water.
Right.
So how does that figure into your thinking?
So the talk right after me is talking exactly about that problem. So I'm going to let Ashley go ahead and speak about that when she gives her talk.
Great talk, thanks. I'm wondering, do you envision this as a central type of still refining on a central level or more decentral?
What do you mean by central?
So, for example, right now oil refineries are pretty centralized. Things are imported from around the world to
I see.
a central facility versus kind of dispersed.
So the good thing about biofuels is that plants grow everywhere in the world, and I think this is why it's particularly great for third world countries that can't import gasoline or anything like that. They can grow their own plants, and I mean, if they had the right tools, they could turn it into a fuel right there. They wouldn't have to move it around, which I think wastes extra energy when you're moving these fuels around. So I think it's great because you can use the crops that are grown wherever you are and not have to deal with that type of a thing.
Right on.
All right, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Thanks again, Kelly.